Thank you so much for your insights. This was very interesting to hear how you notice this major shift in the way Central Asians view themselves, in the way they work with each other now, and the way they communicate with each other. Because we too, I mean, as journalists, we cannot miss that change. On one hand, they want to be seen as these, representatives of unique national identities. They definitely don't want to be seen as former Soviets anymore. But on the other hand, they now realize that they need to work with each other. And yet, you have major differences between the governments, between like the natures of these governments. You were in both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. You were in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, which are two different animals in so many different ways. And Ambassador Kennedy, you were in Turkmenistan at two different times, one under Niyazov and under Berdimuhamedov. So I would like you to talk about the differences, how you navigated, how you adapted, and how you balanced your priorities. I mean, Ambassador Spratlen, you were in Kyrgyzstan when Russia was pressuring Kyrgyzstan, and you still had the air base to keep, right? And you witnessed how Manas closed. Ambassador Krol, you advocated for closer relationship with Islam Karimov because of Afghanistan. You, in a way, you continued what Ambassador Norland started before you. Basically, let's talk to the Uzbeks.
A working relationship.
Right, yeah. And many saw that as quite transactional, right? I mean, let's go get this done. Let's work on Afghanistan because we can, and then continue the conversation to open up the conversation to include more issues. And there are many people in Washington, I know, Clark Adams argues that, even off the record. No, but there is this argument, when we mentioned Uzbekistan a lot, there is this argument in Washington which basically says that the way we worked with Uzbekistan helped Uzbekistan eventually. The strategy that we used with Uzbekistan, in a way like let's focus on things that we can't do now, in a way led Uzbekistan to where it is now. Whereas we could have just shut the doors and say, okay, you're not going to... Okay, fine. Well, we want to hear more on that. But anyways, so let's hear a little bit more about the differences and how you navigated and adapted as you moved from one big country to another. Ambassador?
Well, one thing I'd say about differences is that you mentioned, differences of the government, but what I've seen, in my time in Central Asia, as well as throughout the former Soviet Union, is, the differences that are among the people themselves. I mean, when I was in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or elsewhere and asked people, like, how often have you traveled, Uzbeks traveled to Kyrgyzstan? Because in the past they could just get for a few rubles you could fly, take buses, Tashkent to Issyk-Kul and the like, and people knew one another, of course, crossing the borders, because the borders really didn't exist. Many of them were in the institutions of the Soviet Union where they all got to, of course there was the lingua franca of Russian, but also the Communist Party, serving in the Soviet military, so that, the defense minister of Kazakhstan knew the defense minister of Kazakhstan because they served together. And since they were Central Asians in the Soviet system, they were kind of put in a special category and they didn't get the highest ranking jobs, and so they felt this certain solidarity. And in fact, so a lot of the younger people, I said, do you go to Uzbekistan from Kazakhstan? Have you ever been to Samarkand or Bukhara? No. Why would I want to, there are visas or there are things that they have. And plus, the routes, the trains and air, all that is, it's very difficult to get around Central Asia, as we all know. And one of the reasons why you don't get that many visitors coming from Washington is it's far away, but also there are all these circuitous routes. I mean, there's, I think just Uzbek Air has a direct flight from New York to Tashkent and the like too. And that's something that you see when I'd ask students, when I'd see them all together, like in Almaty and something like that from various countries of Central Asia, and say, like, how do you get to know each other? And they said, well, the only way we've ever met each other was when we were studying together in the United States. And, and the Americans all think, oh, you're the Russian speaking, you're the, and then they all had say the same thing whenever they ask, an American asks, well, where are you from? And they say Kazakhstan. Oh, Afghanistan? Is that everyone's, because that's Afghanistan is in the thing. So, but it's a division because of, well, sovereignty, independence, but also the Soviet, system itself, while all those ties that connected them all were broken. and bringing them back is very difficult, and it's very costly too. You know, all the things like waterworks, the infrastructure that was all shared and everything. Who's going to pay for all of that? And I think what you're saying, though, however, now is that even the Central Asians, the leaders are saying, well, you know, a realization we have to work together ourselves for our future, because otherwise it will be imposed on us from the outside, including you, the Americans, too. So they want to be more, as it were, independent, but they are in a vulnerable position because you got China, you know, and Russia, and, you know, Iran, India, Pakistan there. The U.S. is sort of farther away, and they kind of like having, they would like to have more attention from the United States, but not the type of attention that they would get, you know, for, you know, congressional hearings and things like that. I said, you know, you're, or being a problem case, like this, it's terrorism or something like that, and you get all the attention there. So, you know, I do find that while it's you know, there are also, you know, the good and the bad sides, but the fact that as people, they're becoming more distant. They don't travel. They don't, you know, mix together that well. And you go to like the military academies, and all these officers there, they're all, you know, they're Uzbek or they're Kazakh, they're a national interest, that, and it's not a matter that they know anybody who is from Kyrgyzstan, like, and also that those differences come up in their view of how they view their neighbors as being, you know, if you're down there in South Kazakhstan and like, oh my God, all these Uzbeks are coming in, you know, now that the border's open. So that, you know, it can be good, but it also has
but you dealt with President Karimov,
yeah.
and then you dealt with President Nazarbayev,
Yeah.
who knew each other very well, who had each other's back on many issues.
Well, yeah.
And I mean, what was it like to, you know, to go from Tashkent to Astana? And we want to hear more on that.
Well, I mean, you know, they're different personalities and different types of leaders, and they would let you know how different they were from each other. Too. But, I just don't. Now that he is dead, I mean, President Karimov, when he found that I was appointed ambassador to Kazakhstan, you know, I was called to the Aksaray at night. I was wondering, like, what did I do? And there I was. It was late, you know, and everything, because he liked these things very kind of dramatic and. You know, and he said, "So you don't like our country?" Said, what do you mean? You know, and he says, "Well, why are you going there?" You know, there. I said, "Well, you know, Mr. President, you know,
they know so much about the way
when a president tells you to go, you go. You know." And everything. He says, "Well, you're going to starve up there." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You know, they eat horses up there. You know? What, you don't like our plov?
Uzbeks eat horses?
You don't like our plov?" You know, and I said, "I love your plov." And he said, "Well, you're going to, you know." So then it was like, and it's cold up there. That's how they know. I said, "You don't know how cold." I was just there 2 weeks ago, and I froze my, you know, use the Russian word for what he froze off. And he said, "You're going to freeze." I said, "Yeah, well, you know, I'm used to the cold and everything." "Well, you know, I don't like this and everything too." But then he kind of smiled. He said, you know, if you need warmth, you need food, you know, you can come back here. And so when I got up to, you know, to Kazakhstan, you know, and after presenting credentials, and then we had an opportunity a little later to have a conversation with the president there, and he said, "You know, are you hungry here? Are you cold?" You know, and everything. I said, "You're very well informed, Mr. President." So he said, "Well, we talk to each other, you know, despite it all." So that, you know, there's certainly that rivalry and that very deep. I wouldn't, you know, they came from the same, but in a different way and the like. And I think they had, and I think for President Nazarbayev, his feeling about President Karimov, well, you know, if it, you know, it was the fact of keeping a stable Uzbekistan was important despite everything else that he did. And I think for Karimov, it was also that, you know, out of the ruins of the former Soviet and how something was built, like Kazakhstan, warts and all, was an achievement that they both had and suffered from as well. So there's a certain grudging admiration for each other, too, and to understand what these people went through, and, you know, and their personal feelings and everything is so important. And, you know, it's just that we have to listen, you know, and try to understand them. anyways.
Thank you. Ambassador Spratlen, Kyrgyz democracy versus Uzbek autocracy. I guess that's how it was viewed, right?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose that's one way to look at the difference between the two countries, but I would prefer to focus on a couple of other things.
Sure.
And one would be size, because I think size matters a lot. It's important to remember that there are over 30 million Uzbeks, and the population of the Kyrgyz Republic, and Kadir can correct me if I'm wrong, is around 6 million or so. And so you're talking about countries that have very different self-perceptions on the basis of just of size. Uzbekistan is very proud of being the largest country by population in the region. It also sees itself as the country that was the settled place, and it harkened back often to this idea that they were the country, the ones to watch the leaders during the Soviet time. And I think in some ways this race to change is a way of trying to catch up, if they can, perhaps surpass the Kazakhs. So I think the size issue is extremely important, just in the way the Kyrgyz have to remember that they're not very large, and they've got these much larger regional states near them, Kazakhstan by geographic size and even by population. You know, it's almost 3 times as big as the Kyrgyz Republic by population, and then Uzbekistan. So, and then you have China. So trying to maintain a sense of coherence and national identity in a very mobile population is not an easy thing to do. The thing that was most striking to me is the way the Kyrgyz saw the Uzbeks in 2010 and 2011, when the events just spilled over, as they often do, and when Islam Karimov made the decision to allow the Uzbek population to go to Uzbekistan. And I would often hear from the Kyrgyz leadership, in spite of the great differences in their perceptions of their political trajectories and what they needed to be trying to accomplish in terms of political reform, but there was a great deal of gratitude to the Uzbeks for that decision. The other thing I would say, just about size, is because Uzbekistan is so large by population and divided up with the population center in the Fergana Valley, it's important to remember that there's a lot more congruence once you get to the valley between the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz. And I think one of the things you mentioned is that there are a lot of Uzbeks who listen to your program from the Kyrgyz Republic, because they speak.
And Tajikistan.
Yeah, so we have to remember how these countries were all started, and the fact that even within one country there may be different perceptions of the other based on exactly where someone is. But you're right, there are some great differences, and it was always striking to me when I was in the Kyrgyz Republic of just how comfortable the Kyrgyz were with conflict. I mean, I don't want to say comfortable, but it was just part of life. There wasn't the same need that I felt in Uzbekistan for stability, for the face of everything to be controlled, to be predictable, to be understood in a certain kind of image about what is Uzbek, whereas the Kyrgyz were a good deal more relaxed about that, and I would end up being in, a yurt with, President Otunbayeva and her family, and just kind of hanging out and sitting there with them. And it was a very, very different level of formality between the two cultures. But obviously, it wasn't only a question of size and just their sort of basic approach to things, but the experiences that they had. I think for the Kyrgyz, as hosts of the Manas facility, there were many, many people, and we forget this because it is no more, but there were many people who were very happy and proud about the fact that we were there, that they were playing an important role. A lot of people liked that. But the reality was, it was a constant source of friction with their major strategic partner, the Russians. And where Islam Karimov, and again, this is an issue of size, could every once in a while kind of show certain body parts to folks in Moscow and tell them what they thought about Russia's influence. That was a lot harder to do if you're in the Kyrgyz Republic. And so things like joining the Eurasian Economic Union, asking us to close Manas, these things are, I think, kind of challenges for a country that is Kyrgyzstan's size. I think it has the aspiration, of course, to be an independent state, to pursue its own course, and frankly, they've really done an amazing job of trying to, I would say it's less clear now, but to try to move forward with this political reform path first. It hasn't been easy. It's been very, very challenging, and yet they've stuck to it. They've had peaceful transfer of power. Things have been a bit wobbly, but they've managed to keep things going. prime ministers in jail and all the rest of it, and still they move forward and they maintain themselves. With Uzbekistan, it's a lot more opaque in terms of where things are going politically. The idea of having a central control still seems very important. Ambassador Wells recently called President Mirziyoyev a modernizer, and I think that's a good word for him. He is trying to make the country more modern, but not necessarily a political reformer. I would say that everything is still being run from Tashkent, and the voice, whereas I think Kyrgyz people expect their voices to be heard. They'll gather at the square and they'll tell everybody what they think. Whereas in Uzbekistan, I would say that is still very much led by a centralized control. So I would say those are two big differences that I saw when I was there.
Good, thank you. Ambassador Kennedy? Thank you. Oh, we have this. You can use that.
You can use your own, but I think a microphone might not.
Yeah, we want to put it on.
Can you turn it on?
Yeah, it's right there.
Okay, I think George and Pamela very usefully talked about the navigating different interests among the U.S. And indeed within these different countries, because there are different groups, just as there are in any nation, who have different interests and are vying for attention and resources and so on. Perhaps least so, of course, in Turkmenistan, which is so heavily dominated by the president. One thing I might say, though, and I agree with George, that in independence we knew so little about these countries, and that's why I valued, for example, having been an exhibit guide and getting a chance to get out of the capitals and meet people. I disagree a little bit in that I have been so impressed by the development of our cadres over the years. I mean, look at these two ambassadors. I mean, repeat ambassadors with multiple assignments in Washington and so on. Other ambassadors that we have out there. When I was just out there, I went to see my old friend Dan Rosenblum in Uzbekistan. Decades spent working on assistance programs for Central Asia. Don Liu, again, a repeat offender, I might say. Just the officers I met when I was just out there in September. One young officer had been a Peace Corps in Turkmenistan, first assignment in the State Department, Kyrgyzstan, now serving in Uzbekistan. By the way, I will say that Peace Corps, of which I'm a huge fan, I hope will return to Uzbekistan. Look at what the Peace Corps has contributed, I think, in these countries, but also what a resource of people that have served in men and then go on to work in NGOs or the government or so on. Huge resource, so I do hope that Uzbekistan takes it back. I can't agree more in terms of, I think, the centrality of Uzbekistan. It's always been, the beating heart of Central Asia, although that's what Assad said about Syria, so I guess I should rephrase that. But when I went back to the New York Times and the Smithsonian last month, I crossed the land borders without a diplomatic visa. It's the first time I'd ever done that. Let me tell you, huge difference. But it gives you a sense of the changes that are going on. And it was as if the border guards in Uzbekistan had gone to good border guard school. Huge changes in terms of the ease of getting visas, the ease of which citizens are able to cross. There's still all sorts of rules. I was fascinated, for example, at the Uzbek border, where they have lists of how many of X goods you can import or within a month. But they are so key, I think, to the area loosening up and getting this regional connectivity going that we've talked about. So, for example, just to go back, when I was there in 2014, briefly as the chargé, the water issue had really heated up. And so we were madly working with the World Bank, with the conflict center of the UN there in Turkmenistan, because Karimov was saying, you build Rogun and that's war. Now we have a very different situation, and I hope and I think that our government can be nimble enough to take advantage of those new opportunities in Uzbekistan. And again, I hope that it'll have those spillover effects on other countries. But it's still a challenge. Let me go back to the American University of Central Asia, when George, I think, said that we find that many different say that the only time they've talked to you is that they're out of the country. Well, this is why institutions like this can be so valuable and why we were so happy to support them in the early years. This was an opportunity where you could develop those ties and networks and so on. So I hope indeed that we'll have other countries going there. Again, in terms of the difficulty of navigating these countries, classic case Turkmenistan, one of the most opaque countries out there. When I went in 2001, I was confirmed within 24 hours because it was because of course September 11th made such a big difference and they were eager to get me out there. So obviously supporting the war in Afghanistan was vitally important, but you try, I did, and I think all my colleagues always did, how do you pursue vital U.S. interests, which are very real and extremely important, without compromising American values? And I think there's ways you can do it. So for example, when I would speak publicly, I always talked about the ties between the U.S. and the Turkmen people. And then I just say, of course, it's no surprise that there are many things that we disagree on the government with, but I tried to use my real firepower for when I was sitting down with Niyazov and arguing about programs that were of importance. I used my pathetic Turkmen language skills by when I gave public presentations, getting my little speech and doing it in Turkmen, because I knew that that gave me an entree for this big cultural nationalist. I also knew that if I could say something in Turkmen, there would be less likelihood that they would put words in my mouth. So if you ever heard me say some nonsense, that was probably voiced over. I mean, but it's always a challenge. But again, language I think is very important. And going back to sort of the smart power things, how do you find those things that are of enduring interest? English language. These countries are very, they know that this gives them entree and so on. Development programs, Pamela alluded to, extremely important. And I think we've got a new opening in Uzbekistan that I think is vitally important. But it's always a challenge. And what I had mentioned about sort of the third chapter, as as this president seems to want to sort of move on from Afghanistan, does that mean that Central Asia becomes a backwater? I don't think so. It will always have to fight with any other area for attention at senior levels. But I think developing cadres, people who understand the area and why this area is important, managing expectations, because it's not Russia, it's not China, it's not India. One of the things I had worried about earlier, though, in sort of this second period where Afghanistan became obviously a driving force was, does this area become just derivative of Afghanistan, which I think would be selling this area short. And that was always a bit of a challenge, simply because for example, the CENTCOM commander would come through, the military would come through. They had planes they could visit, easily. And so does this sort of the military presence start driving out other areas? But I think we've worked hard. But that's why when Pamela talked about the hollowing out, this is a problem we face all over the world. That's a challenge, because you need the resources, you need to be out there showing the American flag and showing American values. And when I talked about the importance of public diplomacy and American values and so on, I've always been very proud to represent my government, even though there were issues I didn't agree with them on. But frankly, I worry now about the picture that this administration, and I'm a private citizen, is showing to the world now. I think it's been much more difficult, and I'm speaking only for myself, for American diplomats to be out there talking about American values and talking about the importance of corruption-free, free market groups, the importance of rule of law and so on, when we're presenting a very unattractive picture, I think, to the world outside. So that's what worries me. That's a challenge for all of us as American citizens.
Well, let's open the floor for questions. Okay, we go with Steve, Jennifer, and then Clark. Wow, okay, 3 of you. Right away. Go ahead. We have a mic here. And please, Steve, we know who you are, but introduce yourself again.
For Human Rights Watch, I want to thank all of you for your service, your patriotism, and I really mean that word. Thank you for spending so many hours talking with me and Human Rights Watch over the years about human rights and democracy, and I know how committed you all are. I did want to ask about some of the war stories, some of the things you can talk about now, hopefully, about those difficult moments raising individual human rights cases. Can you share some insights and perspectives about moments when you had to go to the mat and talk about someone detained or tortured, what worked, what didn't work, what you had to weigh, and maybe some of the advice that you give to your colleagues now that are in places like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And I agree with what was said about these contrasts. Despite Kyrgyzstan being what it is and Uzbekistan now looking the way it is, we still have Azimjan Askarov in prison for 9 years, a journalist, a human rights defender. We have Max Bolkaev in Kazakhstan. So these issues are now and very real. So I'm very curious to hear about some of those war stories and challenges we face.
Jennifer, go ahead.
I'm Jennifer Murtazashvili. I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm also a former Peace Corps volunteer from Uzbekistan and still recovering USAID Democracy and Governance Officer from USAID in Uzbekistan from the late 90s, early 2000s. And my question, I think there was like an inherent tension in many of the points that the three of you made. And I also want to thank you, Bahar, for putting this wonderful panel together, and thanks all of you for coming. We heard about value. We've heard about finger wagging. And please understand that I'm asking this question from a position of great sympathy, because I've worked in this area for a long time, care very deeply about it, wondering how the U.S. can be more effective in these areas. And so inherent tensions between sovereignty, an issue that's been raised here, perceptions of sovereignty, raising values, talking about democracy and democracy promotion. And I'm wondering if you could share some lessons for people who are working in this area right now. What do you think the lessons that you have learned about promoting democracy, promoting good governance in the region? If you could have done things differently, if you could have brought that USAID mission out of Almaty into your capital city, what would you have done differently? I think this is a question that, looking at the outcomes that we see now, what kind of both strategic and tactical issues would you have done differently?
Do you want to answer this one, these two first, and then, because I think, Clark, your question, is it about democracy or?
You can go ahead and answer.
Sure, okay, let's go. Yeah. Let's
Clark is one of the
Yeah.
great defenders.
Yeah, no, let's go ahead and take these three questions. Yes, please. Yeah.
Clark Adams, Central Asia Director in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I think it's a unique opportunity right now to have both Ambassador Spratlen and Ambassador Krol here, because you were present at the transition, if I will, and I think Nabahor made a comment earlier, kind of paraphrasing my view, but what I was really getting at is, for a long time, our strategy toward Uzbekistan was like waiting for Krimov to die, and that was kind of where we were stuck. However, in 2008, 2009, because of the Afghanistan support issues and everything else, we started to engage more heavily in the security area. We started to, I think, reverse the relationship that had tanked after Andijan. And the question really gets to is, Mirziyoyev was sitting in the back of the room or in the side of the room for more than a decade. He was thinking about this. How did we set ourselves up? How did the things that you were doing, Ambassador Krol, help to inspire confidence in Mirziyoyev to really make the approaches and open up to Ambassador Spratlen as quickly as they did? I think they were happy with us. Did it make a difference? How did it work? And kind of looking toward the future, where are the other Mirziyoyevs? Where are the other young reformers, basically, within the Uzbek bureaucracy, Uzbek politicians who actually want to continue the path of Mirziyoyev was on?
Thank you. Yes, go on. You start.
As far as preparing Mirziyoyev, I never met him. I wanted to meet him, but Krimov was, he would lay down the law who any ambassador could meet with, and it would be with him, if anyone at all. And so, although one time, I happened to see Mirziyoyev at a function, and he said, "Oh, let's get together." So I immediately contacted back, and I never got an answer back, because I think it had to go through other levels, too. However, I'd say that, and this goes at democracy building and everything, is, to understand, the forces at play here, and the fact that, it's not just an individual, it's not just a Karimov or a Nazarbayev, or I'd say a Mirziyoyev. There's a system, and there's a bureaucracy in there, and bureaucracies by nature, including in our own country, are very conservative. They don't like change, and they like doing things because that's what they're there to, and for better or for worse, they like to. And I think the big challenge for somebody, I think Karimov was supposed to be a reformer too. I mean, Gorbachev put him in there basically to clean up after the scandals of Rashidov. And he was not a member of the clans. He, was picked out. He was a planner. He was, considered an honest fellow in that context, and like too. But again, encountered the deep-seated way of doing business in Uzbekistan that, as much as he would try by putting the power in his own hands, but all these things that he couldn't control underneath there about the continuation of ways of doing business. And I think we see this in Kazakhstan and elsewhere, that real reform, in a way, I mean, it would almost have to tend to be revolutionary, but then what would be the result of that? More chaos, no one knows. And so there's a real sense of don't rock the boat. And I think while they all would like to modernize, and again, Karimov said, I want investment, I want modernization, and they all do, but they don't want to change. It's so hard to change the way of doing business. And I think I found many, young Uzbeks and Kazakhs who went on, the lead program or Bolshak, and they come back, and it's like they're both basically thought they were there to basically help transform the country. And then what they're saying is like, they come back and they're put in a ministry or a company, and it says, you're back home now. You'll do things the Uzbek way or the Kazakh way, or it's the highway. And they felt very frustrated, and they would go to leaders or others and say, what can I do? I went to Maxwell School of Business or whatever. And it was like, well, it takes time. I mean, evolution is very long. Stick with it and everything. And it says, I can't work in this environment. So they go. And this is one of the things, like even with the educational exchanges and everything, people come back and come in and meet, as it were, the system of how it operates, how that will change. I mean, I've talked to people in Ukraine. I had served there too. One of the, what's going to really change if it's not some really fundamental thing? And that, of course, is very frightening, and it's destabilizing and they went through that when the Soviet Union collapsed. But one could say, well, the fact they had these institutions of the Soviet Union that were there made it so it wasn't like, the millions who died when the partition of India and things like that. But so I think, we have to look at this in the context. And that's very hard because for America, in America, because we want change so bad, and we think it can be done. When you say like, well, what could we do better or something like that? Well, to realize even the concept or the idea of democracy, which we think conceptually is so great, I would find many Uzbeks or Kazakhs or others, and even Kyrgyz, when I had people saying, if what's happening in Kyrgyzstan and these revolutions and everything is democracy, that we don't want this as an example. I mean, maybe less so in Kyrgyzstan because it's the system, but the violence, the upheaval, a lot of people don't like, and they feel they're more comfortable with it. And listening to that, and they say, well, how are you, when you talk about democracy, and they're like, it's often, if it's the people and what the people want, it may not be something that, is going to be too pretty, because if you're looking that people look at themselves, there's rich and there's poor, and the poor are left out of the system, and that then becomes, a big issue. So, anyways, I just wanted to make that point. So.
Well, what I would say, since I served in the Kyrgyz Republic and then went to Uzbekistan immediately following Ambassador Krol, the importance of just keeping doors open. I think this is extremely important. Some of you may remember Nelson Letsky, who was with the NDI for many years. And you may also recall that there was an NDI representative office in Uzbekistan for many, many years. I tried to keep them from closing, and they ultimately decided things had just gotten too difficult. But what he always said, and I remember this just from having talked to him, is it doesn't matter whether it's one person sitting in an office with a light on, as long as there's a door header out there that says NDI. From him, it was keeping the doors open. And so the thing for which I was extremely grateful is that before me in Uzbekistan, there had been these very careful and professional ambassadors who were quite pragmatic about dealing with Islam Karimov, who clearly was an extremely tough leader to work with. So many things were difficult. And it's also important for people, and especially if you've been a Peace Corps in the region, just to think about 2005 and what a rupture that was with Andijan. It was huge. And even though there might have been some things that DOD was able to do because there was a pragmatic need to cooperate more over Afghanistan, the fact was the trust had been broken. And so we were spending a lot of time trying to rebuild trust. And part of the reason that was possible was because of the respect that Ambassador Krol and Ambassador Norland had shown the leadership within the parameters of our policy. And what that meant was, because that had been done, then when I came, I would say I was in the latest Karimov period. He was tired. He was getting older. There were people who were starting to talk, not openly, but they were starting to talk about this can't go on. And so there was a feeling of getting to the end of something. It just wasn't clear how they were going to get out of it. And I remember I tried to meet with Mirziyoyev also, and I was promised a meeting with Mirziyoyev. And the day before I was supposed to meet with him, of course, the meeting fell apart. So we were trying to figure out, as you know, as we heard earlier, one of the keys to the way we approach this region was, when are these leaders passing on? And they are, very comfortable and well taken care of, so they're going to last for a while. So before I went to Uzbekistan, and people would say to me, "Oh, you'll be there for the transition," I said, I don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know what's going to happen in the region. The folks are very healthy all over the region in terms of the leadership, and we'll just see what happens. But then there actually was a change. Now, what had happened before made certain things possible, and certain things were impossible. So I do remember having a conversation with a senior official, and I tried to raise the issue on the anniversary of Andijan. And I was told that the issue of Andijan was closed. And so where do you go after that? You don't really have a place to go. And so that to me was a signal, okay, now's not the moment. We're not going to push this. We're going to wait and see what the traffic will bear each moment, always showing respect and always trying to build more trust. I would say there were certain events, and here's where I think the government and the NGO community, not working together in any way, but complementing in some ways efforts. There was one human rights activist in Uzbekistan who had become kind of a flashpoint over the issue of the cotton harvest. This was Yelena Relieva. And some of the treatment that she had received was really beyond the pale. And so showing support for her, first in some nonverbal ways, just through photographs, I think that was important, and it was a signal that, okay, this has gone too far, so you need to figure out something else because this is not acceptable. I didn't have to say anything. Just meeting with the individual, having the picture published, that was one way of respectfully making clear what the United States would accept and not accept, or what our message was about where the lines were. And I think because of handling things that way, trying to be respectful of them but clear about what we wanted to see happen made it possible. I would also say, I don't know if anybody's here from the Congress, but these lists that people put together are, on the one hand, they drive you nuts. Because you've got senator or congressman so-and-so with this or that list of this particular activist or that activist, and you're supposed to go in and try to get X or Y or Z person freed. In a way, the lists ended up being useful because they were a way of saying, symbolically, here are some people about whom we're concerned. We know there are could be dozens, hundreds of other people who are also in the same soup.
Right.
But getting those first activists released in Uzbekistan was huge. And then I think when Mirziyoyev came, and that, remember, that happened when Karimov was still alive.
Right. They started releasing them while he was
What,
still alive.
one
right?
big, who was the person? I'm blanking on the name right now. But anyway.
Jurayev?
No, it wasn't Jurayev. It was, I can't remember. Anyway, there was an activist who was released by Karimov, and that was a huge kind of symbol. And then we all just kind of played it by ear then, trying always to raise the issue, but not pushing it so that we would go too far, knowing that this was important to many people. Again, there are different poles in the U.S. government, as Ambassador Krol has said. Some people, look, security, 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 we're going to deprioritize human rights. Others, human rights, human rights, human rights, we're going to deprioritize, or we don't care about security. So you are, as an ambassador, in this very, very delicate position. But in my view, both positions represent the United States, and so both positions have to be pursued. Not necessarily at the same pace, in the same way for every single day, but you're going to keep moving. So in the issue of religious freedom, we were seeing raids on churches. And so quiet diplomacy. We're not putting out any statements, but we're making very clear to the relevant ministries, this is unacceptable. Here are the names of the congregations, and those sorts of things ended up being helpful in motivating some behavior change. But I think the larger point is that we really are starting from extremely different places on this key issue of values. What is the importance of political reform, and what is the importance of democracy? And I think the Kyrgyz Republic has probably had to sort of deal with this more than the other countries, because they made the decision in a very, very challenging way. And they made the statement twice that this was going to be the priority. And then what was interesting was when their former president, who was previously, when our wonderful Ambassador Jovanovic was there in the Kyrgyz Republic, he was an activist. But things changed when the shoe was on the other foot and he was in power. And then we saw a very, very different person evolving. And I think there were serious concerns about what was going to happen with this political reform democracy path for the Kyrgyz Republic. Fortunately, they seem to have at least come to a modus vivendi. The parliament is still operating. The president is still in his role. Certain people who went to CESS have been removed from the scene. And so whether they're pursuing it with the same vigor that they did before, I don't know. And balancing being members of the Eurasian Economic Union, having Russia as a main strategic partner, and still maintaining some kind of commitment to democracy and political reform is important. Now, I had an opportunity to visit Azimjan Askarov when I was in the Kyrgyz Republic. I think I was probably the last ambassador to see him. It's been some years. I think it's just something that we need to remember, a long way to go. And again, the individuals who are perceived in a particular way by us are not necessarily perceived that same way in the region, and we have to remember that. This is going to be what Colin Powell talked about, the slow, patient work, right? That we're going to keep doing and making progress in our estimation where we can, knowing, again, that these regions have not seen democracy, and not only in the Soviet period, there was no democracy before the Russian imperial government arrived in the late 19th century. So we're not talking about hearkening back to some democratic time that they're going to go to, like the Baltic states. This is creating something whole cloth that's new, and I think there are still reservations about whether this will work when everybody else in their neighborhood is using a style of governance that's a lot more comfortable when you have one person in charge of everything. So I would say that even though the sort of mode of the world after the Arab Spring and all the rest of it, I think will continue to push for more democracy as the middle class rises in these countries, I hope, in Kazakhstan and in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyz Republic. These folks will want a voice in how things, I think it's already happening actually. And Mirziyoyev is trying to figure out how to do that and yet at the same time maintain the control. So it's a fascinating area. We'll have to see how it evolves, and my hope is, so far we've seen it, that we will continue to have very patient and careful professional diplomats who are in these positions of leadership who can balance this very difficult issue of the political reform that we would like to see and the structures of control from the center that are much more comfortable for these governments. It's going to be a long, long road, and we need to remember that. And to Laura's point, our own behavior really matters, because in addition to other things, we are seen as the symbol of what should a healthy, good democratic government do. So if we want to propose that the Venezuelans or somebody else should be Democrats, then we've got to do that ourselves. That's really important.
The last word, Ambassador Kennedy.
Okay, so many points that I agree with, and so emphatically with this point about modeling the behavior that we urge others to adopt. And again, resources. Again, this administration started off by 30% cuts the first year, 30% cuts the next year, 25% the next. Now, as a creature of the executive branch, I used to complain, frankly, a lot about Congress getting their fingers. Well, thank God for Congress, who basically said these budgets are dead on arrival, because we do still matter, but we need to have the resources to do that. I agree with the point that these are ancient civilizations, but young states, so you do have to be patient, you do have to be there, you do have to have those resources. That's also why I believe very strongly in the value of education and exchanges to affect the rising generations. Now, in terms of some of the war stories and what we had to navigate, I guess I picked two examples, and that was I was the DAS when Central Asia still belonged to the European Bureau during Andijan, which was indeed a very drastic moment in our relations. But frankly, I remember getting that call in the middle of the night with the embassy saying there's been some sort of a prison break or something. I was like, huh? But it was a very confused time. So we tried to avoid going to a rush to judgment and say, let's investigate this. I think we tried to prevent a rupture by saying, let's investigate. But again, relations were already under a great strain even before. On K2, as Clark will remember, about the degradation of the runways and the financing and so on. So it didn't sort of come out of the blue, but it certainly was a difficult moment, which we tried, as I say, initially, and I left the job about a month after this happened, to keep the dialogue open, to avoid just condemning them out of hand and saying sort of what happened, let's work on this. But again, Karimov was, ready for a bit of a rupture. Then also in 2002, I was ambassador during the coup against Niyazov, and again, we tried to avoid just condemning him because there had been a coup against him, but focused on rule of law, due process. So there was not a single time that I met with Niyazov then or later when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State where I just said access to prisoners, due process, and so on. But a difficult issue, as we all know, none of those prisoners have, been seen to this day. But I just want to make one plea, and that is, if you don't hear an ambassador lambasting publicly a government over human rights, don't think that this is not absolutely part of the dialogue.
Absolutely.
But oftentimes, you can be more effective in trying to get some results if you deal with them privately, especially in a place like Turkmenistan where you have one person that's in charge. And also I'd say sort of pick your battles. Obviously when I went as ambassador or was DAS or office director earlier, I wasn't going to go in there and talk about the importance of free and fair elections as my first priority. So I focused, for example, when I was there on civil society. This was very rocky ground. Where are sort of the niches where you can get some grassroots to support? So it was things like getting NGOs registered, getting congregations registered rather than meeting that. I guess it was you had to have a congregation of 500 or something. Issues like that. And I also wanted to say the importance I also found in partnering with organizations like the OSCE. with like-minded countries. And again, going back to the importance of alliances with like-minded states is vital. Something else I worry about when we are kicking sand in the faces of countries that are valuable allies in many of these countries, because you want to always be able to amplify your message and not be the only one, as you say, out there wagging your finger. So again, developing partnerships, I think, is vitally important. One of the things I do have a little bit of a concern about is that the proliferation of different reports and report cards. Does that, no, this is, I don't have the answer, but I think it's a debate worth having. Does that make more sense, or does it make more sense to have more of a coherent approach? So that we're talking about overall what we need to tackle rather than having a separate report card for trafficking and religion and so on. I don't know, that's just something to debate. But I tend to believe in more of a coherent approach rather than a piecemeal approach. Let me make one last point, if I didn't make it before, and that is the importance of the academic community. I think, George, you said that sort of like that's not necessarily, top of our agenda.
It's hard to penetrate
exactly,
into the
because it is
daily.
true. We're working with the interagency, the dread monster, the interagency process. But I will say, and let me give kudos to all the academics in George Washington University. This has been an amazing change I've seen over 40 years, the development of academic expertise. GW in particular has had fabulous programs bringing together the NGOs, the foundations, the advocacy groups, and government. Every time I've been to a program here, I have seen desk officers from the State Department. Yeah. I think the DAS was going to be here. So I think actually we do pay attention. I think about the National War College, for example, where I had the opportunity to teach a seminar in Central Asia and the Caucasus with Teresa Sabonis Health. So I think there is more interaction between the academic and the government community, but it always can be nurtured. And so again, thank you for letting me be part of this annual conference, and I hope we can continue all of these connections because we are a very complex society in the U.S. And this is what we also want to encourage in these countries, the development of their own academics, NGOs, and so on.
I'd just say a couple things. Just quickly on the issue, I fully agree on the issue of the academic community. I had a chance to make a presentation at the University of Washington earlier this year, and there are these programs that are focusing on Central Asia. It used to be, Indiana, Colombia, a few, right. And now they're all over the country, which is fantastic. Sometimes tied to Russia, sometimes not, but it really is something that's been, I think, expanding, and I think that's very, very good. Just on the issue of the reports, I just wanted to make one point about democracy. One of the reasons we have so many reports is because of the tendency in our own politics for things to be rather fragmented, right? So I would imagine the trafficking community would be loath to give up the trafficking report. The human rights NGOs would be loath to give up the human rights report, and the religious freedom community would be loath to give up the International Religious Freedom Report. So I think it's important for us to remember that, yes, I agree with you. It'd be great if this could all be more coherent, but some of this is driven by our own politics and our own democracy, where people want their own voices to be heard through these reports, channeled through the U.S. government to give them the imprimatur of officialdom that they wouldn't otherwise necessarily have. So I just wanted to make that point.
You see, now I have the last word.
Yes,
sure.
Whoever holds that.
Sure.
One thing I would say, if I had to do all over again, one thing I've learned as a diplomat, I really wish I had studied clinical psychology, because I think I've learned to become a clinical psychologist, because dealing with leaders, dealing with that, these are people after all. And history, politics, all of that, it's psychology, how people think and react is, I find, is most important.
A new discipline for Central Asia studies, political psychology,
Exactly.
or maybe psychology of the Central Asia leaders, or
American diplomats, psychology of
yeah,
Americans.
American diplomats. No, I mean, we can never have enough time, obviously,
Yeah.
but it's been an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for making time, for being available, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't get to so many different questions, but a lot of interesting points came up, and we will continue. I mean, I, for one, live and breathe Central Asia, Uzbekistan every day. There are many of us in Washington who watch very closely what happens there and here. We're very much connected, and all those reports, oh my God, they keep our lives very interesting. And I think ambassadors would have a very different workload if they did not have these reports.
But thank God for journalists. We didn't
Thank
talk
you.
about
No, we didn't.
journalists.
Yes, absolutely.
Keep the flame